welcome to Sleepy Folktales. Tonight, I'll share with you a story that drifts straight from the waters of old Slavic legends. It is the tale of the Vodyanoy, the water spirit who lingers in rivers and ponds, a guardian and a trickster, feared and respected by those who lived close to the water. His world is one of rippling depths and quiet danger, but also of mystery and wonder. Before we begin, I invite you to join our community of listeners. Leave a comment sharing where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always magical to see how many of us are connected across the world, united by stories under the same sky. And if these tales bring you comfort, consider subscribing so you never miss another night's journey. Now, let us travel into the quiet waters where the Vodyanoy waits. The pond lay quiet at the edge of the forest, its dark surface reflecting the fading colours of the evening sky. To the villagers, it was just another part of the landscape, useful for fishing, for water, for turning the old mill wheel nearby. Yet when the sun dipped below the horizon and the air thickened with the calls of frogs, people lowered their voices, for they knew the pond was never truly empty. Beneath the still waters dwelled the Vodyanoy, the ancient water spirit whose presence was as steady as the current itself. The stories about him were many. Some described him as a bloated old man, his skin greenish and damp, his beard tangled with river weeds, his eyes as cold as stone at the bottom of a well. Others swore he could take on the shape of a handsome stranger, luring the unwary into the water with charm instead of fear. But all agreed on one thing: he ruled the ponds, rivers, and lakes, and those who crossed him paid dearly. Horses dragged into the depths, fishermen found floating lifeless, mills cursed to stand still. Each was said to be the Vodyanoy's doing when angered. On certain nights, when the moon was full and round, villagers whispered that he could be heard rising from the pond. His body, dripping and slimy, would emerge, and he would sit on a broken log or stone smoking his pipe. The smoke curled above the water, carrying the scent of something damp and sharp, like moss and wet ash. Those foolish enough to spy on him claimed his laughter echoed across the pond, low and hollow, like the groan of the mill wheel in the dark. None dared to approach too close, for it was said that his gaze alone could pull a man under, his soul tied to the weight of the water. Yet the Vodyanoy was not only a figure of fear. The old miller, who lived closest to the pond, often spoke quietly of leaving small offerings, bread, tobacco, even a splash of vodka, on the bank. He believed it kept the mill wheel turning smoothly, the waters calm, and the fish plentiful. Respect him, the miller said, and he may let you be. Forget him, and he will remind you. Few laughed at the old man's words, for his mill had never once faltered, even when flood struck the valley or drought emptied other rivers. One summer evening a boy wandered too close to the pond. He skipped stones across the surface, watching the circles widen and vanish. For a while it was only water, but then the air grew still, and the ripples lingered longer than they should. In the far corner, where the reeds stood thick, bubbles rose slowly to the surface. The boy froze. A pale hand, webbed and dripping, broke through the water, followed by another. Slowly a figure pulled itself up, its long beard trailing weeds, its eyes gleaming in the dim light. The boy stumbled back, his heart pounding. The figure smiled, a wide, unnatural grin, and the boy turned, running without looking back, his stones forgotten on the bank. That night, the villagers found wet footprints leading from the pond toward the mill. They ended abruptly at the door, as if the water spirit himself had paused to listen before returning to his depths. The miller only nodded grimly, lighting his pipe as though to answer a call no one else could hear. The following days in the village passed under an uneasy hush. People worked in their fields, gathered in the market square, and shared meals in their homes, but there was always a glance cast toward the pond, as though the water itself might be watching. Mothers called their children back sooner than usual, their voices sharp when little feet strayed too close to the bank. Even the animals seemed restless. Horses snorted at the pond's edge, and dogs barked into the reeds, hackles raised. The villagers knew these were signs. The Vodyanoy was stirring, and when he stirred, the balance between man and water grew fragile. The elders remembered other times when he had made himself known. They told stories of fishermen who had ignored the traditions, boasting they needed no offerings for their catch. One by one their nets had come back empty, their boats overturned in calm waters. Another tale spoke of a traveller who washed his horse in the pond without permission. By dawn the horse was gone, and the traveller was found in the reeds, pale and trembling, unable to recall how he had escaped drowning. These tales were not simply warnings, they were memories, kept alive because the pond itself never forgot. One evening the miller prepared his offering. He carried a wooden bowl filled with black bread, salted fish, and a small clay cup of vodka. He moved carefully down the worn path to the water's edge, his lantern swinging low, casting gold on the ripples. He set the food gently on the bank and poured the vodka into the pond. For a moment the water remained still. Then, slowly, it shifted, as if something deep below had taken a breath. Bubbles rose, bursting quietly at the surface, and the miller bowed his head. "Keep the waters kind," he murmured. "Keep the wheel turning." Behind him, unseen, a shadow rose in the reeds. The Vodyanoy lifted his dripping form from the pond, eyes glinting in the lantern's glow. His broad shoulders gleamed with wet moss, and his tangled beard hung heavy with river plants. He did not move forward, but he watched, the smoke of his pipe curling around him like mist. The miller, though he did not turn, felt the weight of that gaze. He remained bowed until the sound of water slipping back into itself told him the offering had been accepted. When he returned to the village, he said nothing, but the next morning the mill wheel creaked to life with a steady rhythm, stronger than before. Not all in the village shared the miller's respect. There were always the curious and the careless, drawn to the mystery of what lay beneath the pond's dark surface. A group of youths dared each other one night to step into the shallow waters, laughing as they splashed, mocking the old tales. Their laughter carried across the fields, but so did another sound, a low rumble like distant thunder, though the sky was clear. The reeds began to sway, though no wind stirred. Then, with a sudden pull, one of the boys was dragged waist-deep into the water. He screamed, thrashing wildly while the others scrambled back. Just as quickly as it began, the grip loosened, and he stumbled onto the bank, coughing and gasping, his eyes wide with terror. His ankle bore the red imprint of a hand, wet and unnatural. From that night on, none of them returned to the pond after dark. The Vodyanoy had made his point, as he always did. He demanded respect, not cruelty or play. To him, the pond was not a place for childish games. It was a realm, a kingdom beneath the surface, and those who entered without permission risked his wrath. And so the villagers whispered to each other, as they always had, carrying forward the old truth. The Vodyanoy was patient, but never forgetful. He could sit in silence for weeks, months, even years, but when disturbed, his anger came swift as the rush of a sudden flood. The boy who had been pulled into the pond was not the same after that night. Though he survived, his laughter dimmed, and he often woke in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, claiming he heard water dripping inside his room though no rain had fallen. His friends avoided speaking of what happened, but in their silence the story only grew heavier. The red mark around his ankle lingered, fading slowly over weeks, as if the hand that had grabbed him had left a scar deeper than flesh. His grandmother, an old woman with eyes sharp as winter frost, burned herbs by his bed and whispered prayers, yet even she admitted that the Vodyanoy's touch was not easily erased. Word of the event spread quickly. Farmers, fishermen and washerwomen all carried the tale with hushed voices. Some swore they had seen ripples move across the pond even when the air was still. Others claimed they had spotted a shape beneath the water, a hulking figure, its outline shifting like a man's but broader, heavier, covered in weeds and mud. Whether truth or imagination, these sightings added weight to the fear already hanging over the village. The pond became less a place of resource and more a place of power, one whose patience could not be relied upon forever. One evening, the elders gathered in the tavern. The fire crackled low, casting long shadows, while mugs of warm mead were passed around. Their voices, though weary, carried authority. They spoke of the old rites, traditions long neglected. In the past, they explained, the Vodyanoy was honoured at each season's change. Offerings of bread and milk were cast into the water at spring, honey in summer, grain in autumn, and a small carved figurine in winter. Each act reminded the spirit that he was remembered and respected. But in recent years these customs had faded. The younger generation, eager to shrug off these superstitions, no longer kept the rites alive. "It is no wonder he is restless," one elder muttered. "We have forgotten him." And he does not forgive being forgotten. The miller, who had seen the shadow by the reeds, nodded gravely. He urged the village to revive the traditions before the anger of the water spirit grew into something worse. Reluctantly they agreed. Plans were made to hold a gathering at the pond during the next full moon. Everyone would bring something, bread, fish, milk or mead, to lay at the water's edge. A fire would be lit nearby, not as a challenge, but as a beacon, a sign of acknowledgement. The elders insisted it must be done properly, with respect and solemnity, lest the offering be seen as mockery. As the day of the full moon approached, the atmosphere in the village shifted. There was a hush in the air, a cautious reverence. Children were warned to behave, to speak softly near the pond. Women prepared loaves of bread shaped like fish, and men brewed mead stronger than usual. Even the youths who had once mocked the old tales walked with lowered eyes, as if the memory of the hand around their friend's ankle still clutched at their throats. That night, when the moon rose wide and silver, the villagers gathered, lanterns flickering in their hands. Together they made their way to the pond, heart steady but nervous, aware that unseen eyes waited in the depths. The water reflected the moon like a mirror, broken only by the occasional ripple. The villagers laid their offerings carefully one by one, and the fire crackled as flames licked upward into the night. Then silence fell, so deep that even the crickets seemed to hush. All eyes turned to the water. For a long moment nothing happened. Then, with a low rolling sound, bubbles began to rise in the centre of the pond. The reeds shifted, swaying though no wind stirred. Slowly a shape emerged, a broad, hunched figure, dripping with weeds and mud, eyes glowing faintly green in the moonlight. The Vodyanoy had come, his pipe clenched between his teeth, smoke curling upward. He did not speak, but he did not need to. His presence alone carried weight enough to still the crowd. The villagers bowed low, trembling as the water spirit surveyed the offerings. For a heartbeat, the pond seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a deep splash, the Vodyanoy sank beneath the surface once more, dragging the food with him. The fire sputtered, then steadied, and the air grew lighter. A murmur ran through the crowd. Relief, awe, and fear mingled as one. They had been acknowledged, and for now spared. After the gathering, the village carried on with a renewed sense of caution. The mill wheel turned steadily, the fishermen's nets filled with silver flashes of perch and pike, and the cattle drank from the troughs without balking. Yet the memory of the Vodyanoy's appearance lingered like smoke clinging to cloth. Parents reminded their children to bow their heads when passing the pond, and even the boldest youths avoided its banks at night. Peace had been restored, but it was fragile, like ice over deep water. The boy who had once been dragged into the pond was brought along to the full moon gathering, though he trembled through the entire ritual. In the weeks that followed, his dreams shifted. No longer did he wake from nightmares of drowning hands. Instead, he began to see strange visions of the pond in moonlight, glowing softly, as if calling him. At times, he heard whispers in his sleep, words that vanished the moment he opened his eyes. His grandmother, watching closely, said nothing, but in her heart she feared that the Vodyanoy had marked him, not to punish, but perhaps to claim him in another way. The elders debated this quietly. Some believed the spirit was angry, and that the boy would one day be dragged beneath the water, never to return. Others whispered that he had been chosen, not cursed. The Vodyanoy, they argued, sometimes sought human servants, keepers who could walk the line between land and water, carrying his will. Such talk unsettled the villagers, for to serve a spirit was both an honour and a doom. The boy, unaware of these hushed discussions, only knew that the pond no longer frightened him. Instead, it drew him near, as though it held answers hidden from the rest. One misty morning, as the village stirred awake, the boy walked to the pond alone. The water lay still, reflecting the pale dawn sky. He crouched by the reeds, listening. For a long while there was only silence, then faintly he heard it, the slow rhythmic sound of a pipe being smoked. The surface rippled, and bubbles rose, breaking softly. The boy whispered, "I'm not afraid." From the depths something shifted. A shadow moved beneath the water, circling slowly like a great fish or a man too heavy for the waves. The boy's heart pounded, but he did not flee. He waited, and the ripples spread outward, brushing against his boots before fading back into calm. That evening he returned again, and the evening after that. He began to spend more time near the pond, silent and patient, sometimes speaking aloud as though to an unseen listener. The villagers noticed, and their unease grew. His friends no longer dared to join him, fearing that the water would claim them as well. yet he remained untouched, even when he waded knee-deep into the shallows. The Vodyanoy, it seemed, had claimed him in a gentler way, allowing him to linger where others would be punished. This, the elders agreed, was both wondrous and dangerous. One night, during the next full moon, the boy stood by the pond as the silver light painted the water. He carried no offering, no bread or fish. Instead, he raised his hands and whispered, "What do you want of me?" For a moment, there was no reply. Then the reed swayed, and the water stirred. Slowly the hulking figure rose again, dripping with moss and reeds, his green eyes glowing like lanterns in the dark. The villagers, watching from a distance, gasped. The Vodyanoy did not move toward them, only toward the boy. He bent low, so close that the boy felt the cool spray of his breath. No words passed, but in that silent gaze something was exchanged, a pact, unspoken yet binding. The spirit sank back into the depths, and the pond fell still once more. From that night on, the boy was different. He spoke less, watched more, and often slipped away to the water's edge. The villagers whispered that he had become the spirit's messenger, though what messages he carried were known only to him and the depths. The grandmother prayed harder, clutching her charms, but she could not keep him from the path chosen for him. The Vodyanoy had marked him, and whatever fate lay ahead, it would be written in water and shadow. Seasons shifted, and the village adapted to its uneasy peace with the pond. The fields bore grain, the mill wheel turned, and life went on as if the shadow in the water were only another neighbour to be respected. Yet beneath this fragile normalcy, tension grew. The boy, now older, spent more and more time at the pond. He listened to the reeds as though they whispered secrets, and his eyes often carried a distant look, like one who sees beyond the horizon. When asked what he heard, he only replied, "The water speaks." This answer unsettled many, for no one else dared to listen long enough to hear anything at all. The grandmother grew frail, her hair white as frost, her hands trembling as she worked her charms. She often warned him, "Spirits do not give without taking. Remember this, my child." But he only smiled faintly and continued his visits. Once she followed him at dawn, her feet silent in the dew. She watched as he knelt by the pond, speaking softly. The water rippled, and a faint outline appeared just beneath the surface. Broad shoulders, a tangled beard, eyes faintly glowing. Her heart pounded, but the boy showed no fear. Instead, he reached his hand into the water. For a moment, the figure rose enough to press a dripping hand against his. Then it vanished, leaving her trembling, torn between awe and terror. From that day, she told no more warnings. She knew they would go unheard. In the village, rumours spread. Some said the boy was learning forbidden knowledge, that the Vodyanoy was teaching him secrets of the deep, old songs that could calm storms or stir floods. Others believed he was doomed, destined to vanish one day into the pond, never to be seen again. Yet no misfortune came. Instead, the mill turned smoother, the harvests were kinder, and even the fish in the river seemed more plentiful. The people, though uneasy, began to accept that perhaps his strange connection brought blessings, even if they came with shadows. One autumn evening, as golden leaves drifted across the pond, a sudden storm rose without warning. The sky darkened, thunder cracked, and rain lashed down in sheets. The villagers scrambled indoors, shutters slamming, prayers whispered into the dark. But when they looked out, they saw the boy standing at the water's edge, arms raised, his cloak whipping in the wind. The pond churned like a cauldron, waves breaking against the banks. And then, as quickly as it began, the storm eased. The rain softened to a drizzle, the thunder retreated, and the pond calmed to stillness once more. The villagers whispered in awe. They believed they had witnessed proof. He was no longer merely marked, but bound to the spirit's will. From then on, the boy's presence at the pond became ritual in itself. He was seen at dawn, speaking softly as mist rose from the water. At dusk, when the first stars pricked the sky, he lingered by the reeds, and always the pond answered, ripples forming where none should, bubbles rising as though the depths breathed. The elders warned the villagers not to interfere, to let this bond run its course, for to break it might mean angering not only the boy but the Vodyanoy himself. Yet unease remained. Parents told their children never to follow him, never to mimic his strange ways. Some believed he had become a bridge between worlds, while others whispered he was only a pawn in the hands of something too old, too vast to understand. Still, the land prospered, and fear softened into wary acceptance. The boy had grown into a young man now, his gaze always half turned toward the pond, as if waiting for something no one else could see. His fate, the villagers knew, was no longer entirely his own. It belonged as much as their harvests and their lives to the spirit of the water. Winter settled over the village, cloaking the fields in snow and freezing the pond into a sheet of dull silver. The villagers were grateful for the season's stillness, but they never forgot what slept beneath the ice. They left offerings on its edge even in the cold, bread frozen stiff, honey crystallized in jars, small wooden figurines carved by trembling hands. They believed the Vodyanoy still listened, still watched, even from beneath the thick ice. No one dared to test his patience by assuming he slept. The young man, once only a boy pulled beneath the surface, now walked with quiet certainty. His connection to the pond had deepened, though he spoke little of it. Sometimes he lingered at the water's edge even in the dead of night, when the wind howled and snow whipped through the trees. Villagers whispered that his shadow stretched unnaturally long across the frozen surface, as if another shadow followed him, mirroring his every move. Some swore they heard faint pipes playing beneath the ice, the sound muffled but steady, as though the spirit's breath never ceased. One evening, the village gathered for the midwinter feast, a tradition meant to drive away the darkness of the longest night. The tavern glowed with firelight, laughter, and song. But outside, the pond cracked sharply, a sound like thunder splitting the air. The villagers froze mid-song, fear flickering in their eyes. They rushed to the banks, lanterns swaying. A great fissure had formed across the ice, splitting it open in jagged lines. From the black water below, bubbles rose, breaking against the edges of the crack. The young man stood apart from the others, watching with a calm the rest did not share. He whispered, too low for the others to hear, "I know. I am here." The fissure closed slowly, the ice knitting back together, leaving only thin white lines as scars across the surface. The villagers, trembling, hurried back to their homes, but they could not shake the thought that the pond had spoken, that the spirit was restless once more. The young man, however, seemed untroubled. He began carving small tokens from wood, shapes of fish, waves, even human figures. He left them at the pond's edge, and always by morning they were gone. The villagers asked him why he did this, but he only answered, "Because he asked me to." The grandmother, frail as she had become, watched with sorrow. She knew that this bond had grown beyond any human will. The Vodyanoy had claimed her grandson not with chains, but with whispers and promises, pulling him deeper into a world that mortals could not fully understand. She prayed, not for release, but for mercy, that when the spirit's will was finally revealed, the boy would be spared the crueler paths that legends so often foretold. But deep in her heart she feared the truth. The Vodyanoy gave nothing without price, and the debt was still waiting to be paid. Spring returned, breaking the ice and flooding the fields with meltwater. The pond, freed from its winter prison, shimmered darkly as though eager to breathe again. Birds sang from the budding trees, and farmers sowed their seeds, grateful for fertile soil. Yet beneath the season's renewal, the villagers felt the same quiet tension. They lived by the pond's mercy, and that mercy was never certain. Offerings became more frequent, with bread and milk left at the bank every week, sometimes more. The elders urged caution. The spirit is restless after winter. Do not tempt him. The young man seemed to grow alongside the pond's awakening. He no longer lingered only at its edge, but began to venture into the water itself. On misty mornings he was seen wading knee-deep, his arms outstretched as though listening to something only he could hear. Fishermen swore they saw ripples circle him without ever touching his skin, as if the water itself respected his presence. Others whispered he walked farther into the depths than was safe, yet always returned, calm and unharmed. The more he immersed himself, the more the villagers feared that he belonged less to them and more to what lived beneath. One day, a merchant caravan stopped in the village. Travellers from distant towns brought news, cloth and tools, but also stories. They spoke of other villages cursed by restless spirits of river and lake, floods sweeping away homes, whirlpools dragging boats into darkness. The villagers listened uneasily, glancing toward their pond. When the travellers noticed their fear, they laughed and said, "If such a spirit dwells here, he is merciful compared to others. You should count yourselves fortunate." But this comfort rang hollow, for they knew their fortune hung by a thread as thin as a reed. That evening, the young man sat at the pond with a carved token in his hands, a figure shaped like a fish. He placed it on the water, and instead of sinking, it floated, carried by ripples that seemed to form deliberately. The villagers watching from afar swore they saw a hand, broad and dripping, rise from beneath to take it gently before vanishing again. The young man smiled faintly, as though acknowledging an old friend. To the villagers the sight was both a blessing and a warning, proof of the bond, proof of the power. Soon after, strange things began to happen. Tools left by the water's edge returned in the morning cleaned of rust. Fishers who lost nets in the pond found them tangled on the shore, mended with reeds. Even the livestock seemed calmer, drinking freely from the pond without balking. These were small wonders, but they unsettled the people. Gifts from a spirit were never given freely. They always carried weight, a reminder that something greater waited in the shadows. The elders warned, "Enjoy the blessings, but do not forget. They come at a cost." The young man, however, seemed at peace. When asked about the gifts, he said only, "He takes care of what belongs to him." The words chilled the villagers, for they realized he no longer spoke of himself as fully human, but as something tied irrevocably to the pond. His gaze grew more distant, his voice softer, and often he disappeared for hours, returning with clothes damp as if he had been walking beneath the water itself. The grandmother, fading fast with age, clutched her charms and whispered prayers, but even she knew her grandson had crossed a line no mortal could return from. The Vodyanoy's claim was complete, though what shape it would take, no one could yet say. Summer came, and with it, long days of heat that drew the villagers to the pond's edge. Children splashed in shallow streams far from the main waters, watched carefully by their mothers, while men worked the fields until sweat soaked their backs. The pond glistened beneath the sun, appearing almost inviting, but everyone remembered the stories too well to linger. The villagers spoke of the Vodyanoy more often now, not as a myth, but as a neighbour, dangerous, unpredictable, but undeniably present. His shadow hung over every task, every harvest, every song. The young man had changed even more. His eyes now carried a strange gleam, reflecting water even in the driest light of day. When he spoke, his words often slipped into rhythms like waves lapping at a shore. Some said his voice carried echoes, as though another spoke with him from beneath. He still carved his wooden tokens, but now they took stranger forms, creatures no villager recognized, shapes that seemed half man, half fish, twisted yet graceful. He placed them at the water's edge, and always they vanished by morning. The elders whispered that the pond was teaching him, shaping him in ways no human should be shaped. One night, the village held a midsummer gathering. Fires blazed in the fields, songs rang into the sky, and food and drink flowed freely. But the young man did not join them. Instead, he went to the pond, where moonlight shimmered on its glassy surface. Witnesses swore they saw him step into the water, deeper and deeper, until only his head remained above. Then, with a slow movement, he sank beneath. Panic spread through those who saw, and they rushed to the edge, but before they could act, he rose again, walking calmly back onto the shore. His hair was slick, his clothes dripping, yet he breathed easily, his eyes glowing faintly green. When questioned, he said only, "I was with him." None dared ask more. After that night, the villagers avoided him. He was no longer one of them, not fully. Children whispered that he smelled of pondweed, that his skin was cold to the touch. Yet they also noticed the village prospered as never before. The crops grew tall, the fish swam plentiful, the rains fell when needed but never in floods. It seemed the Vodyanoy, through him, had granted a blessing. But blessings, the elders reminded everyone, never lasted without cost. That cost came in whispers first. Livestock vanished near the pond, leaving only damp prints in the mud. A fisherman's son disappeared after wandering too close to the reeds. The villagers searched, torches blazing, but found nothing but rippling water. Fear surged again, and all eyes turned to the young man. Some accused him of luring the boy, others of failing to protect him. He said nothing, only stared at the pond as though waiting for an answer. That silence was worse than any denial. It told the villagers what they already feared. The boy was gone, claimed by the water, and the young man had no power or no will to stop it. From that moment the villagers' trust cracked. Some saw him as their saviour, the one who kept the Vodyanoy appeased. Others saw him as cursed, a servant of the spirit, perhaps even its pawn. Fights broke out in this tavern, neighbours turned suspicious, and prayers grew louder in the night. The grandmother, too weak to leave her bed, wept quietly. She had hoped her grandson might bridge two worlds, but she now saw the truth. No bridge could stand forever between man and spirit. Eventually, one side would claim him completely. Tension grew in the village like a storm building on the horizon. The fields still yielded, the fish still filled the nets, yet the unease outweighed the blessings. Every disappearance, every odd sound in the night was whispered to be the Vodyanoy's doing. And always the villagers looked to the young man, who walked among them with eyes that seemed to see things no one else could. He no longer laughed or joined in their gatherings. His presence carried silence, heavy and unsettling, as though he brought the weight of the pond wherever he went. One day, a council was called. The elders gathered the villagers in the square, torches burning even in daylight. Voices rose in anger and fear. Some demanded the boy be banished, sent away from the village so the spirit's gaze might follow him alone. Others argued that driving him out would only provoke the Vodyanoy further. The debate swirled like a current, pulling in every voice. At last, the miller, who had once offered bread and vodka to the spirit, spoke. "We forget," he said, "that he is still of our blood. If the pond has marked him, then he is both our burden and our protection. To cast him out is to cast out the balance we have left." His words calmed some, but suspicion still burned in many eyes. That night, as the council dispersed, the young man walked once more to the pond. He knelt by the reeds, his reflection broken by ripples. "Why do they fear me?" he whispered. From the depths came no voice, only the faint curl of bubbles rising, bursting at the surface. Yet he felt the answer in his bones, because he was no longer entirely theirs. He belonged to the water, to something older and deeper than any village. The truth both comforted and unsettled him. He was not alone, but he was not free. The following days brought strange omens. Nets pulled from the river came tangled with black weeds that did not grow nearby. Cattle lowed nervously, refusing to drink even from clean troughs filled with pond water. At night, lanterns flickered without wind, and more than one villager swore they saw a wet, hunched figure standing in the fields before vanishing like mist. Fear turned to desperation. Families clutched charms, doors were barred tighter, and prayers filled the air with every dawn and dusk. Yet despite all of this, no harm came directly, only reminders, subtle and sharp, that the pond's shadow stretched farther than its banks. The young man felt the change as well. When he entered the water, it welcomed him, circling his legs with cool currents. Sometimes he thought he heard words in the gurgle of the pond, promises, commands, or warnings he could not tell. The more time he spent submerged, the less he felt the chill, until even the deepest waters seemed no colder than air. He began to dream of halls beneath the pond, vast caverns lit with green fire, where the Vodyanoy sat on a throne of reeds and stone. In these dreams the spirit's eyes gleamed, and his pipe smoked endlessly. Each time he awoke, his chest ached with longing, as though part of him wished never to return. The villagers noticed his distance. Mothers pulled their children away when he passed, and men crossed themselves beneath their breath. He did not fight this isolation. He seemed to accept it, even welcome it. For in truth, he was no longer bound to their world alone. He straddled two realms, and with each passing day, the pull of the water grew stronger, while the tether to land frayed thinner. The grandmother, watching from her window, whispered into the night, "He is slipping, and none of us can hold him back." The final days of summer brought a heavy stillness to the village. The air hung thick, Storms threatened but never came, and the pond seemed darker than ever, its surface gleaming like a polished mirror that reflected nothing but dread. The young man was seen less in the village now. His steps carried him always toward the water. When he did appear, his clothes clung with damp, his hair smelled faintly of reeds, and his eyes glowed faint green in the firelight. To the villagers, it was as if he were already half swallowed by the pond. One evening, the grandmother summoned what strength remained in her bones and called him to her bedside. Her voice was frail but firm. "My child," she whispered, "the water does not give. It only trades. Do not forget who you are." He clasped her hand, cold against his, and bowed his head. "I remember," he said, though his tone carried more sorrow than conviction. She tried to hold him with her gaze, but her eyes blurred, and tears ran down her cheeks. That night she passed in her sleep. Her charms clutched tightly to her chest. The boy, no, the young man, laid them at the pond the next morning. They sank without a ripple. After her passing, the bond deepened. He was seen at the pond at all hours, sometimes standing still for so long he seemed part of the reeds themselves. Rumours spread that he spoke now in two voices, his own and another beneath it, low and resonant like the current in a deep river. Some villagers feared he was no longer their kin at all, but a vessel, hollowed and filled with the will of the Vodyanoy. Others clung to the thought that he remained their protector, that his strange servitude spared them from worse fates. But all agreed on one truth: his life was no longer his own. Then came the night of the harvest moon. The village gathered in hushed fear, knowing instinctively that something would happen. The air was thick, the pond glass still, and the reeds swayed though no breeze stirred. The young man walked to the water's edge, his silhouette outlined by silver light. He turned once toward the village, his expression unreadable, then stepped into the pond. Deeper and deeper he went until the water reached his chest, then his shoulders. He paused, as though listening to a call only he could hear. Then he vanished beneath the surface. The villagers held their breath, waiting. Minutes stretched into eternity. Some prayed, others whispered curses. At last the water stirred. Bubbles rose, then burst. A shape emerged. Not the young man alone, but something greater, hulking, dripping with weeds and stone. The Vodyanoy stood with him, side by side, their forms merging in the shimmer of moonlight. For a heartbeat, the villagers swore the two were one. The man's face pale within the spirit's dripping beard, their eyes glowing together like twin lanterns in the dark. Then, with a great splash, both sank into the depths. The pond stilled. Silence fell, broken only by the crackle of torches. The villagers stood frozen, unsure if they had witnessed a death, a binding, or a coronation. Days passed, and the young man did not return. The mill still turned, the crop still grew, and the fish still filled the nets. Yet unease lingered, heavier than ever. Some said he lived now beneath the water, seated beside the Vodyanoy as a chosen servant. Others whispered that he had become the spirit himself, his humanity dissolved into the depths. No one knew the truth, and perhaps no one ever would. And so the story ended, not with peace, but with a shadow cast across the village. The pond remained, calm and dark, reflecting the sky as if nothing had changed. But those who lived there knew better. Each ripple, each bubble, each shift of reed was a reminder. The Vodyanoy was still watching, and somewhere beneath the surface, so was the boy who had once belonged to them. Whether protector or threat, no one could say. They only knew one truth, whispered from mouth to mouth, a truth as old as the pond itself. Water never forgets.